The invitation sat on my desk like a coiled snake. Cream cardstock, gold lettering, my sister's name embossed at the top. Maid of honor, Jessica Chen, not me. Jessica again. I set down my phone, barely suppressing a smile as my assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. Miss Reynolds, the Luminex acquisition papers are ready for your signature. Their CEO is waiting in conference room A. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, I said, picking up the invitation again. The bride's name glittered beneath Jessica's. Sarah Mitchell, my former best friend, my sister's new best friend, and as of 3 hours ago, an employee of Reynolds Capital Group, the company I now owned. They had no idea I was coming to that wedding. They had no idea who I'd become. And they certainly had no idea that I'd let this happen. All of it. Every betrayal, every slight, every cruel replacement. I'd allowed it to unfold exactly as it had in my previous life. Because this time, I knew how the story ended. And I was rewriting the finale. The conference room door clicked shut behind me, and I watched Sarah Mitchell's face drain of color as I extended my hand. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Adrian Reynolds, your new CEO. I believe we have a lot to discuss about Luminex's future, and yours. The first time I died, I was 26 years old. I remember the exact moment, the screech of tires, the impact, the way the world tilted sideways as my car rolled down the embankment. I remember thinking about Jessica, about how she'd convinced me to drive home in that storm, how she'd needed to stay at Sarah's engagement party just a little longer, while I went to pick up the cake she'd forgotten at the bakery across town. I remember the last thought I had before everything went dark. She did this on purpose. When I opened my eyes again, I was 18 years old, standing in my childhood bedroom with my acceptance letter to Stanford clutched in my hands. The same letter that in my first life my mother had hidden from me for 3 weeks until it was too late to accept. The same letter that had been the beginning of the end. But this time, I was holding it on the day it arrived, because I'd been waiting for it. The memories of my previous life had crashed over me the moment I'd woken up on my 18th birthday, vivid and complete. 26 years of life, 8 years of systematic destruction by my own family, all of it preserved in perfect clarity. I'd spent that first day locked in my room, weeping and shaking, reliving every betrayal, every manipulation, every casual cruelty. My mother, Patricia Chen, had never wanted me. I'd known that even in my first life, but I hadn't understood the depths of her resentment until it was too late. I was the daughter from her first marriage, the reminder of the man who'd left her, the obstacle between her and the perfect family she'd built with my stepfather, David Mitchell. David Mitchell, Sarah's father. That connection had seemed like fate when Sarah and I became best friends in high school. It had seemed like I was finally going to be part of a real family. In my first life, I'd been so grateful, so pathetically eager to belong that I'd missed every warning sign. Jessica was my half-sister, 5 years younger, and my mother's favorite from the day she was born. Beautiful, charming, gifted at playing the victim, she'd learned early that the world revolved around her and that I existed only to make her life easier. In my first life, I'd accepted that role. I'd been the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who sacrificed everything to keep the peace. And it had killed me. The memories were so clear. My mother hiding my acceptance letter, telling me Stanford had rejected me, pushing me toward the local community college instead. Jessica needs you here, she'd said. You're her big sister. She looks up to you. She'd cried, actually cried, about how much Jessica would miss me. I'd stayed. I'd gone to community college, living at home, working 2 jobs to pay for Jessica's dance lessons, her art classes, her essential summer programs. I'd watched her get into Juilliard on a scholarship I'd helped her write the essay for. I'd stood by as my mother and David poured money into Jessica's dreams while telling me I needed to be more practical. Sarah had been my lifeline through all of it. My best friend since freshman year of high school, the one person who seemed to see me, to value me. We'd been inseparable. She'd been the maid of honor at my wedding to Tom, except no, that had been in a dream, in a future that never happened. In my first life, I had never gotten married. Tom had left me for Jessica 3 weeks before our wedding. That had been the first real crack in the facade. Jessica had pursued Tom deliberately, methodically. She'd befriended him, confided in him about her difficult family life, painted me as controlling and cold. By the time I realized what was happening, he was already in love with her. The wedding was called off. My mother had consoled Jessica, telling her it was meant to be, that I should be happy for my sister's happiness. I'd been too broken to fight. I'd moved into a tiny apartment, taken on more hours at my job, tried to rebuild my life. And then Sarah had called me. "I'm getting married," she'd squealed into the phone. "And of course you're going to be my maid of honor. You're my best friend, Adrian. I can't imagine doing this without you." I'd cried from relief. Finally, something good. Finally, I mattered to someone. For 6 months, I'd thrown myself into planning Sarah's wedding. I'd used my savings to pay for her bachelorette party, spent weekends addressing invitations, coordinated with vendors, handled every crisis. Sarah had seemed grateful, effusive even, though she'd been strangely distant in person, always busy, always canceling our plans at the last minute. I'd found out why 2 months before the wedding. I'd shown up at Sarah's apartment to drop off the final seating chart using the key she'd given me years ago. I'd walked in to find Sarah and Jessica in the living room, surrounded by wedding magazines, laughing like old friends. "Oh, Adrian," Sarah had said, her face flushing. "I didn't know you were coming by." "I texted you," I'd said slowly, looking between them. 3 hours ago, about the seating chart." "Oh, right, sorry, I've been helping Jessica with something." She'd glanced at my sister, something passing between them that I couldn't read. Jessica had smiled at me, that sweet, innocent smile she'd perfected. "Sarah's been helping me plan Tom's and my engagement party." "Isn't she amazing?" The world had tilted. "Your engagement party?" "We're getting married!" Jessica had held up her hand, showing off a ring I recognized. Tom's grandmother's ring, the one he'd promised me. "Isn't it exciting? And Sarah's been so wonderful, helping me plan everything." I'd looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, to acknowledge the insanity of this situation. Instead, she'd squeezed Jessica's hand and said, "Jessica deserves to have the perfect celebration. Family is so important." Family, the word had hung in the air like poison. "I should tell you," Sarah had continued, not meeting my eyes. "Jessica's going to be my maid of honor now. I hope you understand. She and I have gotten so close over the past few months, and with everything you're going through, I thought you'd appreciate not having the pressure." "Everything I'm going through?" I'd repeated numbly. "You mean my fiancé leaving me for my sister?" "See," Jessica had said softly. "You're still so angry." Sarah doesn't need that negativity at her wedding. It's her special day. They'd replaced me, just like that. My best friend and my sister, united in their betrayal, looking at me like I was the problem. I'd still gone to the wedding. God, I'd still gone, in a dress I'd bought with my last paycheck, watching Jessica stand at the altar as maid of honor, watching her catch the bouquet, watching her and Tom announce their own wedding date at the reception. I'd watched Sarah's father, David, my stepfather, give a toast about how wonderful it was that their families were so close, how Jessica was like another daughter to them. No one had mentioned me. I'd been erased. After the wedding, things had gotten worse. My mother had called to tell me I was being selfish for not being happy for Jessica. David had stopped paying for my health insurance, saying I was old enough to handle my own finances. The family had closed ranks, and I was on the outside. I'd thrown myself into work, into survival. I'd taken a job at a startup working brutal hours for barely minimum wage, but I'd been good at it. I'd had a mind for business, for numbers, for seeing patterns others missed. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted to manager. Within 4, I was a director, but it hadn't been enough. The startup had been acquired by a larger company, and I'd been let go in the restructuring. I'd been 25, jobless, and alone. I'd started freelancing, taking on whatever consulting work I could find, building a modest savings account. Then my mother had called. Jessica's wedding was in a month. She needed help with the cost. Could I contribute? "How much?" I'd asked, already knowing I'd say yes, hating myself for it. $50,000. I'd laughed, a bitter sound. "I don't have $50,000. "You have savings." Jessica showed me your bank statements. My blood had gone cold. What? Don't be dramatic. You're her sister. Family helps family. We need you to take out a loan if necessary. I'd refused. For the first time in my life, I'd said no. 2 weeks later, I'd been driving home in a storm, sent on an errand by Jessica herself, when my brakes had failed. The police report had called it an accident, faulty maintenance. But I'd known. In those last moments, as my car had tumbled down the embankment, I'd known. Jessica had been learning about cars from Tom, who was a mechanic. Jessica, who'd borrowed my car the day before. Jessica, who'd looked at me that morning with something dark and satisfied in her eyes. She'd killed me for refusing to fund her wedding. Standing in my bedroom at 18 holding that Stanford acceptance letter, I'd made a choice. I wasn't going to run, I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to take the easy path of using my knowledge to simply avoid my family and build a different life. I was going to let them think they'd won. I was going to let every betrayal happen exactly as it had before. And then, when they least expected it, I was going to destroy them. But first, I needed to build an empire. I'd hidden the Stanford letter in a place my mother would never think to look, inside Jessica's room taped under her desk drawer. Then I'd acted devastated when the rejection came. I'd enrolled in community college. I'd gotten the same jobs, made the same sacrifices. But this time, I'd been strategic. Every dollar I'd earned, I'd split. Half went to the family obligations, keeping up appearances. Half went into a secret investment account I'd opened with fake documents and a P.O. box address. I'd known which stocks would soar, which cryptocurrencies would explode, which startups would succeed. In my first life, I'd watched these opportunities pass by while I'd struggled to survive. This time, I'd seize them all. By the time I was 21, I'd had $3 million in that secret account. By 23, it was $20 million. I'd also started building a network. I'd befriended people who would become important, invested in companies that would dominate their industries, positioned myself as a silent partner in ventures that would change the world. I'd used different names, worked through shell corporations, stayed completely off my family's radar. To them, I was still poor Adrian. Still struggling, still their convenient scapegoat. I'd let Jessica steal Tom from me again. I'd even helped her win him, feeding her information about his interests, his dreams. It had been easy to manipulate them both into falling in love. Jessica was predictable in her selfishness, Tom was predictable in his weakness, and together, they'd played out the same script as before. When Sarah had called about being her maid of honor, I'd said yes immediately. I'd thrown myself into the role with even more enthusiasm than before, knowing exactly what was coming. I'd also, quietly, begun buying shares in Luminex Industries, the mid-sized pharmaceutical company where Sarah worked as a senior researcher. Her father David was on the board. Sarah was dating the VP of Operations, Marcus Webb, the man she'd eventually marry. In my first life, I'd never known much about Sarah's work. She'd kept that part of her life separate, professional, but this time I'd paid attention. I'd done my research, and I'd discovered something interesting. Luminex was financially troubled. Poor management, bad investments, mounting debt, they were vulnerable to acquisition. And Sarah, brilliant Sarah, had been developing a revolutionary drug that could save the company, except she'd been doing it on company time with company resources, and the patent belonged to Luminex, not to her. That drug would be worth billions. I'd known because in my first life, I'd read about it in the news 5 years later, after Luminex had been acquired by a massive conglomerate. Sarah had gotten a small bonus. The new owners had gotten rich. This time, I was going to be those new owners. I'd spent 3 years carefully building Reynolds Capital Group, a private equity firm that specialized in pharmaceutical acquisitions. I'd recruited the best team, made strategic investments, built a reputation for turning around struggling companies. I'd done it all through proxies and intermediaries, never showing my face, never using my real name in public filings. To my family, I was Adrian Chen, the failure. To the business world, I was A.R. Mitchell. I'd legally changed my last name, another small twist of the knife, the mysterious investor who'd made several billion-dollar deals. No one knew they were the same person. I'd made sure of it. And now, 6 months before Sarah's wedding, just as Jessica was befriending Sarah in my place, just as I was being replaced as maid of honor, Reynolds Capital Group had made its move. We'd acquired Luminex Industries in a hostile takeover that had taken exactly 2 weeks. David Mitchell had been forced off the board, Marcus Webb had been demoted, and Sarah's revolutionary drug? It now belonged to me, which meant Sarah belonged to me. The day I'd walked into that conference room as the new CEO, seeing Sarah's face drain of color as she realized who I was, had been the sweetest moment of my second life. Ms. Mitchell, I'd said, letting the name roll off my tongue. I'm Adrian Reynolds. I believe we should discuss your future with this company. The transformation from Adrian Chen to Adrian Reynolds had been carefully constructed over years. I'd had plastic surgery, subtle changes that made me look different enough that people wouldn't immediately recognize me, but not so dramatic that I looked like a different person. Cheekbones sharpened, nose refined, chin slightly altered. I'd changed my hair from mousy brown to a striking platinum blonde. I'd hired a stylist who'd transformed my wardrobe from clearance rack bargains to bespoke designer pieces. I wore contact lenses that changed my eye color from brown to gray-blue. But more than the physical changes, I'd changed how I moved, how I spoke, how I commanded space. The old Adrian had been apologetic, diminished, always making herself smaller. The new Adrian was 6 feet of confidence in Louboutin heels, with a voice that made boardrooms go silent and a gaze that could freeze blood. I'd legally changed my name during a year I'd spent in London studying. Another strategic move, giving me time to establish my new identity far from anyone who might recognize me. Adrian Reynolds had emerged fully formed, a young CEO with mysterious backing, an uncanny instinct for profitable investments, and zero tolerance for incompetence. When I'd returned to San Francisco, I'd rented a penthouse in Pacific Heights, driven a Tesla, and moved in circles that never intersected with my family's middle-class suburban existence. I'd been hiding in plain sight, and it had worked perfectly, until the day I'd decided to stop hiding. That first meeting with Sarah had been carefully orchestrated. I'd scheduled it for 8 a.m. on a Monday, giving her no time to prepare, no warning that the mysterious A.R. Mitchell was actually someone she knew. My assistant had simply called her late Friday afternoon. Ms. Mitchell, please be in conference room A at 8 a.m. Monday for a meeting with the new CEO. I'd arrived at 7:55, reviewing the file on Sarah one more time. She'd done well at Luminex, published several papers, earned her PhD while working full-time. In another life, with different choices, she might have been someone I admired. But she'd chosen Jessica over me. She'd chosen the easy path of pleasing my family over loyalty to her best friend. And now she was going to pay for that choice. Sarah had walked into the conference room at exactly 8 a.m., flanked by 2 other senior researchers. She'd been dressed professionally in a navy suit, her dark hair pulled back, her expression nervous but composed. She hadn't recognized me at first. The platinum hair, the designer suit, the commanding presence had all registered as important stranger, not old friend. I'd let her sit down, let her introduce herself and her colleagues, let her begin her prepared remarks about the drug development program, and then I'd interrupted her. Ms. Mitchell, have we met before? She'd paused, confused. I don't believe so, Ms. Reynolds. Are you certain? You look familiar to me. She'd studied my face more carefully then, and I'd watched the exact moment recognition had dawned. Her eyes had widened. Her mouth had opened slightly. The color had drained from her face. Adrian, she'd whispered. Ms. Reynolds, I'd corrected coolly. Or Ms. Chen, if we're being formal about my legal surname. Though I prefer Reynolds now. It has a better ring to it, don't you think? More powerful, more presidential. The silence in the room had been absolute. Sarah's colleagues had looked between us, confused. Sarah had looked like she might be sick. I don't understand, she'd stammered. You own Luminex? I own 52% of Luminex as of last Monday, yes, which makes me your boss, Ms. Mitchell. So perhaps we should start this meeting over. Tell me about your research. Tell me why I should keep funding your department. Tell me why I should keep you employed. I'd watched her struggle to compose herself, to reconcile the Adrian she'd known, poor, defeated, easily dismissed, with the woman sitting across from her in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. The drug, she'd finally managed, were in phase 2 trials. It could revolutionize treatment for I've read your research, I'd interrupted. I've read everything about your drug, Ms. Mitchell. I know exactly what it's worth. The question is, do you? She'd swallowed hard. It could be worth billions if it succeeds. It will succeed, I'd said flatly, because I'm going to ensure it succeeds. And when it does, Reynolds Capital will reap all the benefits. You'll receive a salary and some standard bonuses, but the patent, the profits, the glory, those belong to me now. That's how it always worked, she'd said weakly. The company owns the patent. I was always just an employee. Yes, I'd agreed. You were and you are. You're an employee, Ms. Mitchell, a replaceable employee. I want you to remember that. I'd let that sink in before continuing. Now, I've been reviewing the personnel files. I understand you're getting married in 6 months. Congratulations. Her face had paled further. Thank you. I also understand your fiancé, Marcus Webb, was the VP of operations here. He's been reassigned to a regional office in Montana. He'll start next month. Montana? The word had come out as a gasp. But we live here. Our wedding is here. His family? Company needs, I'd said with a shrug. I'm sure you understand. Of course, he's welcome to resign if the reassignment doesn't suit him, though I wouldn't recommend it. Jobs are scarce these days, especially for executives with his particular track record. I'd leaned forward, letting her see the steel in my eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Ms. Mitchell. You're going to continue your research. You're going to produce excellent results. You're going to make me a great deal of money. And in return, I'll allow you to keep your job and your benefits. Your fiancé will learn to love Montana, or he'll find other employment. Those are your options. Adrian, she'd whispered, please, I know I hurt you. I know I should have been a better friend. But this is Ms. Reynolds, I'd corrected again. We're not friends, Ms. Mitchell. We're employer and employee. I suggest you remember that distinction. She'd fled the meeting within minutes, her colleagues trailing after her in confusion. I'd sat in the conference room alone, allowing myself a small smile. It had begun. Over the next month, I'd systematically dismantled every aspect of Sarah's comfortable life. The reassignment of Marcus to Montana hadn't just been petty revenge, though I'd certainly enjoyed that aspect. It had been strategic. Marcus had been skimming money from Luminex's operational budget, hiding the theft through clever accounting. In my first life, this had eventually been discovered, but only after he'd married Sarah and tanked her reputation by association. This time, I'd found the evidence in my first week as CEO. And instead of firing him or prosecuting him, I'd given him a choice. Take the reassignment and never speak of his theft, or face criminal charges and ruin both his and Sarah's careers. He'd taken Montana. He'd also, I'd learned through my network, begun having an affair with a woman in his new office within 2 weeks of his arrival. Marcus was nothing if not predictable. Sarah had tried to maintain her composure at work, but I'd seen the cracks forming. She'd submitted requests to transfer to our Montana facility, all denied. She'd tried to find other jobs, but I'd made sure that every pharmaceutical company she applied to received a confidential call from Reynolds Capital's legal team, mentioning ongoing intellectual property concerns that might complicate hiring decisions. She was trapped, and she knew it. Meanwhile, I'd been cultivating a relationship with Sarah's parents, my stepfather David and his wife Claire. They didn't know who I was, of course. To them, I was just A.R. Mitchell, the powerful CEO who'd taken over the company where their daughter worked, whose last name happened to be the same as theirs by coincidence. I'd invited David to lunch to discuss board member severance packages. He'd been grateful for the meeting, eager to save face after being forced off the board. Over expensive sushi in my favorite downtown restaurant, I'd been charming, sympathetic, understanding. It's nothing personal, Mr. Mitchell, I'd told him. Reynolds Capital has specific requirements for board composition, but I'd love to discuss other ways you might contribute to the company. Perhaps as a consultant? His eyes had lit up. That would be wonderful, Ms. Reynolds. Call me Adrian, I'd said, watching his face carefully. The name hadn't registered. Why would it? His stepdaughter, Adrienne Chen. The failure bore no resemblance to Adrian Reynolds, CEO. Adrienne, he'd repeated. Oh, that's a lovely name. Actually, my stepdaughter, well, my wife's daughter from her first marriage. Her name is Adrienne, too. What a coincidence, I'd murmured. Tell me about your family, David. May I call you David? And he had. Over the course of that lunch, he'd told me everything about his wife, Patricia, about their beautiful daughter, Jessica, about Jessica's upcoming wedding to a wonderful man named Tom, about Sarah, his precious daughter who'd just gotten engaged, about how close Jessica and Sarah had become, like sisters. And your stepdaughter? I'd prompted. Adrienne, does she get along with them? His face had darkened slightly. Adrienne's had a difficult time. She's never quite fit in with the family. Very different from Jessica, more withdrawn, less ambitious. We've tried to help her, but she's resistant to guidance. I see, I'd said, sipping my wine. That must be hard for you. It is, he'd sighed. Patricia tries, but Adrienne doesn't appreciate what she has. She doesn't understand how much we've sacrificed for Jessica's success, the opportunities we've given her. I'd nodded sympathetically, all while mentally calculating exactly how much money I was going to cost him. Family can be complicated. Indeed, he'd agreed. But blood is blood. We do our best. I'd smiled at him then, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Yes, blood is blood. We certainly do our best. By the end of that lunch, I'd hired David as a consultant for $10,000 a month, just enough to make him dependent on me, just enough to give me leverage. And I'd extracted a promise. He'd introduce me to his family. I'm always looking to expand my network, I'd told him, and you've spoken so highly of your daughters, I'd love to meet them. Of course, he'd said eagerly. Sarah works for you already, of course, and Jessica, well, she's quite remarkable. I'm sure you'd enjoy meeting her. I'm certain I would, I'd said. The introduction had happened 3 weeks later at a charity gala I'd known my family would attend. It had been a breast cancer research fundraiser, Jessica's favorite cause, ever since she'd lied on social media about having a cancer scare to gain sympathy and donations. The posts had been fake, the sympathy real, and she'd raised thousands of dollars that had mysteriously never made it to any actual charity. I'd bought a table at the gala, the most expensive tier, and had invited David as my guest. He'd brought Patricia, Jessica, and Tom. Sarah had declined, pleading work obligations, by which I knew she meant she couldn't face seeing me outside the office. I'd arrived late, making an entrance, wearing a custom Valentino gown that had cost more than my family's annual income. Heads had turned. People had whispered. David had looked like he'd won the lottery when I'd approached their table. David, I'd said warmly, kissing his cheek. Thank you for coming, and you must be Patricia. My mother had looked me up and down, taking in the dress, the jewelry, the aura of wealth and power. I'd seen the calculation in her eyes, the immediate assessment, useful person, cultivate connection. She'd had no idea she was looking at her own daughter. It's lovely to meet you, Ms. Reynolds, she'd said, her voice dripping with false warmth. David has told us so much about you. Please call me Adrienne. I'd watched her face. Still nothing. The name meant nothing to her when attached to this version of me. What a beautiful name, she'd cooed. Actually, my daughter is also named Adrienne. Yes, David mentioned, I'd said smoothly. What a coincidence. Is she here tonight? Oh, no, Patricia had said quickly, a flash of something ugly crossing her face. She doesn't really participate in family events. She's very independent, very busy with her own life. I see. I'd turned to Jessica then, finally allowing myself to look at her directly. And you must be Jessica. Your father has told me you're getting married soon. Congratulations. Jessica had been stunning, as always. She'd worn her beauty like armor, her smile practiced and perfect. She'd extended her hand, rings glittering. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Yes, we're getting married in 3 months. We're so excited. Tom had stood beside her, uncomfortable in his rental tux, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd barely glanced at me. I'd been too wealthy, too polished, too far out of his league to register as anything but intimidating. 3 months, I'd said. How wonderful. And I understand Sarah Mitchell is going to be your maid of honor? Jessica's smile had tightened slightly. Yes, Sarah and I have become very close. She's been so helpful with planning. She's a wonderful person, I'd agreed. I should know, she works for me. In fact, I've been meaning to discuss her performance review. Tell me, Jessica, in your experience, is she reliable? Trustworthy? The question had been calculated, loaded with implication. Jessica had sensed a trap, but couldn't see where it was. Of course, she'd said carefully. She's been a great friend. Interesting, I'd murmured. Because I've found her work lately has been distracted. Personal issues, perhaps? I'd hate to think her obligations outside work were affecting her performance. I'd seen Patricia's eyes gleam. Here was an opportunity to disparage someone, and my mother had never been able to resist. Oh, you know how Sarah is, she'd said conspiratorially. Always so focused on herself. We've been bending over backward to help her with this wedding, but she never seems satisfied. Really? I'd said, injecting surprise into my voice. That doesn't sound like the Sarah I know. She's always seemed quite professional. Perhaps there's been a miscommunication. Perhaps, Patricia had said stiffly, realizing she'd been gently corrected. I'd spent the rest of, the evening circulating, making sure to return to their table periodically, dropping comments designed to unsettle them. I'd mentioned considering a position for a brilliant young woman researcher I was mentoring, making Jessica jealous. I'd praised David's consulting work in terms that made it clear it was charity. I'd asked of Patricia about her own career, knowing she'd been unemployed for 15 years and deeply insecure about it. And with Jessica, I'd been subtle but devastating. You know, I'd said during one of our conversations, your name seems so familiar to me. Jessica Chen, I feel like I've heard it before. Have you been in the news? Not that I know of, she'd said, laughing nervously. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else. There was a charity fraud case a few years back. Some woman who'd falsely claimed illness to raise money. The name was similar. Chen or Chang, something like that. Awful thing. She went to prison. Jessica had gone pale. That wasn't me. Of course not, I'd said smoothly. Just a strange coincidence. Though it makes me think, you're raising money for breast cancer research tonight, aren't you? That's so generous. Do you have a personal connection to the cause? Yes. I had a scare a few years ago. A scare? I'd let the skepticism show in my voice just slightly. Not actual cancer? No, just tests, false alarm. I see. Still, I'm sure the organization appreciates your support. You are donating tonight, I hope? I'd hate to think someone was here just for the appearance of charity without the actual substance. She'd written a check on the spot, $5,000 she probably didn't have, just to avoid looking bad in front of me. I'd doubled it casually, pulling out my own checkbook and making it out for $10,000. For such a worthy cause, I'd said. And in honor of your family, David. Consider it a bonus for your excellent consulting work. David had nearly wept with gratitude. Patricia had looked at me like I was a golden goose. Jessica had looked at me with something darker, envy and calculation mixed with a hint of fear. They'd invited me to the wedding, of course. All of them had insisted. We'd be honored if you'd attend, Patricia had gushed, as a friend of the family. I wouldn't miss it, I'd said. And I'd meant it. The next 2 months had been a carefully choreographed ballet of manipulation and power plays. At Luminex, I'd continued to tighten my control over Sarah's life. I'd approved her research funding, but demanded weekly personal briefings, meetings where she had to sit across from me and pretend we were just colleagues, while I asked pointed questions about her wedding plans, her relocated fiancé, her stress levels. You seem tired, Ms. Mitchell, I'd say. Is everything all right at home? Everything's fine, she'd lie. Are you certain? Because if personal matters are affecting your work, we should discuss it. Reynolds Capital values work-life balance. Perhaps you need time off, unpaid, of course. She'd gritted her teeth and assured me everything was perfect. I'd also begun implementing new policies at Luminex. Random audits of old projects, reviews of past patent filings, investigation into irregularities in previous management decisions. Each audit happened to uncover something embarrassing about Sarah's department, her colleagues, or her previous supervisors. Nothing fireable, but enough to create an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Through it all, Sarah had continued planning her wedding. A wedding that was growing smaller by the day as Marcus remained in Montana, as their budget tightened, as the stress mounted. Meanwhile, I'd become Jessica's new best friend. It had been absurdly easy. I'd run into her accidentally at high-end boutiques, at exclusive restaurants, at gallery openings she'd crashed hoping to network. Each time I'd been gracious, generous, interested. I'd complimented her taste. I'd asked about her wedding. I'd offered help. You know, I'd said one afternoon over lunch at a Michelin-starred restaurant I'd taken her to, I have connections with some wonderful wedding vendors. If you'd like, I could make some introductions. Her eyes had lit up. Really? That would be amazing. We're working with what we have, but it's not quite... I want everything to be perfect, you know? Of course you do, I'd said warmly. Every bride deserves perfection. What if I told you I could help make that happen? I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Consider it a gift. My treat. And that's how I'd begun funding Jessica's wedding. Subtly at first, a discount through my connections on flowers, a friend who did photography who'd work for free. Then more openly, offering to pay for the venue upgrade, the designer dress, the premium catering. I want to do this, I'd told her, watching the greed war with suspicion in her eyes. You remind me of someone I used to know, someone I cared about very much. Let me do this for you. She'd accepted. Of course she had. Jessica had never turned down anything free in her life. My mother had been ecstatic. Suddenly, the wedding she'd been stressing over, the costs she'd been worried about, were all taken care of by this generous, wealthy new friend. She'd welcomed me into the family with open arms, inviting me to dinners, to planning sessions, treating me like an honored guest. They still didn't recognize me. Not once in all those dinners and meetings did any of them see their Adrian in Adrian Reynolds. The hair, the makeup, the clothes, the confidence. It was too different. And more than that, I think they simply couldn't imagine their failure of a daughter could become someone like me. Their worldview couldn't accommodate that possibility. Sarah, however, was becoming increasingly desperate. She'd tried to warn them, I'd heard through the grapevine. She'd pulled Jessica aside one day and said, "There's something wrong with Ms. Reynolds. She's the one who's been incredibly generous and kind," Jessica had interrupted. God, Sarah, you're so paranoid. Just because she's your boss doesn't mean she's evil. Maybe you're jealous that she's been so good to me. Sarah had given up after that. What could she say? That her boss was her old best friend seeking revenge? It sounded insane. And she had no proof. I'd been scrupulously professional at work, never overstepping legal boundaries, never doing anything she could report to HR or document as harassment. I was just her boss, demanding, exacting, but technically fair. The fact that I was using my personal wealth to insert myself into her social circle and fund her future sister-in-law's wedding? That wasn't illegal. That was just strange. 6 weeks before the wedding, I'd made my next move. I'd invited Jessica to lunch and told her about my foundation. I've been meaning to tell you, I'd said, pouring her a glass of wine that cost more per bottle than her monthly rent. I run a foundation that supports young women in the arts. I've been very impressed with you, Jessica. Your grace, your style, your artistic sensibility. Have you ever considered a career as an influencer or brand ambassador? Her face had transformed. This had been her dream, I'd known. In my first life, she'd tried desperately to become Instagram famous, to monetize her beauty and her wedding. She'd failed, mostly because she'd had no connections and no capital. I've thought about it, she'd admitted. but it's so hard to break into. Not if you have the right backing, I'd said. What if I told you my foundation wanted to sponsor you? Give you a platform, a budget for content creation, connections to brands? You'd be our first official brand ambassador. Are you serious? She'd breathed. Completely, but there's one condition. She'd leaned forward eagerly. Anything. Your wedding needs to be perfect. I mean, truly perfect. I want to document it, turn it into content for the foundation. The perfect wedding series. You'd be the face of it. But that means no compromises, no budget cuts, everything top tier. Yes, she'd said immediately. Yes, absolutely. Good, then let me handle everything. I'll pay for all of it. Consider it an investment in your future. I'd watched her practically vibrate with excitement, with greed, with the intoxicating rush of getting everything she'd ever wanted handed to her on a silver platter. She had no idea she was building her own cage. Tom had been the hardest sell, but only because he was suspicious of things that seemed too good to be true. He'd pulled me aside one evening when I'd come to the house to discuss wedding plans with Jessica and my mother. Ms. Reynolds, he'd said, his jaw tight. Can I talk to you for a minute? Of course, Tom. Call me Adrian. We'd stepped into the backyard away from the others. Tom had crossed his arms, looking uncomfortable but determined. Why are you doing all this? For Jessica, for the wedding? What's your angle? Angle? I'd raised an eyebrow. Nobody gives away this much money for nothing. You barely know Jessica. So what do you want? I'd smiled at him, genuinely amused. Tom wasn't smart, but he had good instincts. Too bad they came too late. I like your fiancé, I'd said simply. I think she has potential. And I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Why not use it to help someone? Just like that? Just like that. I'd paused, then at his height. Does my generosity make you uncomfortable, Tom? Yeah, kind of. Why? Do you think Jessica doesn't deserve nice things? That's not what I... Or maybe you're worried that if she gets a taste of this lifestyle, she'll realize she could do better than a mechanic? His face had flushed with anger. Good. I'd wanted him angry, defensive. I'm not... Relax, I'd said, softening my tone. I'm joking. Jessica loves you. That's obvious. But let me ask you something. Do you love her, truly? Of course I do. Do you? I'd let the question hang. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's trapped, who made a choice he's not sure was right, who looks at his beautiful fiancée and wonders if he gave up something important for something shiny. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Adrian Chen. I'd watched his face carefully. Jessica mentioned her sister, the one who doesn't come around anymore, the one you were engaged to before Jessica. He'd gone very still. That's none of your business. You're right, it's not. But I'm curious. Do you ever wonder what happened to her? Where she is now? If she's happy? Why would you ask me that? Because I think you do wonder. I think you wonder a lot. And I think marrying Jessica is your way of trying to prove you made the right choice. I'd stepped closer. But you didn't, did you? You left Adrian for Jessica because Jessica was easier, prettier, more accommodating. But Adrian was the one who actually knew you, who actually loved you. And you threw her away. How do you know about any of this? His voice had been shaking. Jessica talks, I'd said with a shrug. She tells me everything about her sister, about the family dynamics, about how easy it was to take you from Adrian. She's quite proud of it, actually. I'd watched the horror dawn on his face, the realization that the woman he was about to marry had been bragging about their betrayal to a stranger. Now, I'd continued. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to marry Jessica. You're going to smile in all the photos. You're going to play the happy groom. And you're going to remember every single day of your marriage that you're married to a woman who sees other people as props in her story, including you. I don't have to listen to this. No, you don't, but you will, because you know I'm right. And because if you walk away now, if you call off this wedding, Jessica will destroy you. She'll tell everyone you're unstable, abusive, controlling. She'll play the victim so perfectly that your own mother won't believe you. You know she will, because you've seen her do it to Adrian. He'd had nothing to say to that, because it was true, and we both knew it. So, here's my gift to you, Tom, I'd said softly. I'm going to give you the wedding of the century. I'm going to make sure Jessica gets everything she's ever wanted, and then, for the rest of your life, you're going to live with the consequences of your choice. You're going to watch her take and take and take, never satisfied, always wanting more. And you're going to remember that you could have had something real instead. I'd left him standing in the backyard, pale and shaking. He'd married her anyway. They always did. The week before the wedding, everything came together. I'd held a final meeting with Sarah, ostensibly to discuss her research progress. She'd sat across from me in my office, her face drawn, her eyes tired. Marcus had asked for a divorce the week before, the affair in Montana having become serious. Her wedding was off, her life was in ruins, and she still had to sit in my office and pretend everything was fine. Your research is excellent, I'd told her. The Phase 2 trials are ahead of schedule. The FDA approval looks promising. Thank you, she'd said dully. I've decided to put you in charge of the entire project, I'd continued. Lead researcher, your name on all the papers. You'll get the credit you deserve. She'd looked up at me confused. Why? Because you earned it. Your work is brilliant, Sarah. It always has been. You're going to change the world with this drug. I don't understand. Why are you being kind to me? I'm not being kind, I'd said. I'm being fair. You did the work. You deserve the recognition. The fact that you betrayed your best friend and helped destroy her life, that's separate. She'd flinched. Adrian? Ms. Reynolds, I'd corrected. And yes, Sarah, it's me. It's always been me. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you? That I wouldn't remember every single thing you did? I'm sorry, she'd whispered. I was wrong. I was weak. Jessica was so persuasive, charming, good at making herself the victim. I'd leaned back in my chair. I know, she's had years of practice. But you chose her over me anyway. You chose the easy friendship over the real one. I know, I'm so sorry. If I could go back, but you can't. None of us can. I'd smiled then, cold and sharp. Well, most of us can't. I had the unique opportunity to relive my worst years, and you know what I learned? That you all were exactly as selfish and cruel as I remembered. Even when I knew what was coming, even when I watched for any sign of redemption, you all made the same choices. What are you going to do? She'd asked, fear evident in her voice. Nothing, I'd said. To you, I mean. You're going to keep your job, get your recognition, probably win several awards for this research. You'll be famous in your field. You'll be successful. And every single day, you're going to remember that the woman who gave you all of that was the best friend you betrayed. I'd stood up then, moving to the window, looking out at the city. That's your punishment, Sarah. Success without joy. Achievement without satisfaction. You're going to have everything you wanted professionally, and it's going to taste like ash because you'll know what you sacrificed to get here. She'd left my office in tears. Good. The day of the wedding arrived on a perfect California morning, all sunshine and blue skies. I'd had my stylist come to the penthouse at dawn, creating a look that was both stunning and unmistakable. Hair in a sophisticated updo, makeup flawless, wearing a custom gown that had cost $50,000 and looked like I'd stepped off a red carpet. I was a vision of wealth, power, and success. I was everything they'd never imagined I could be. The wedding was at the Fairmont, in the grand ballroom I'd paid for. I'd arrived early before most guests and had taken my seat in the back watching as the room filled. My mother and David, dressed in their finest, greeting guests with proud smiles. Tom, looking like he might be sick, standing at the altar. Jessica's bridesmaids, including a pale and miserable Sarah, who'd been unable to refuse the role. And then the music had started, and Jessica had appeared at the back of the room. She looked beautiful. The dress I'd paid for was a masterpiece of lace and silk, her hair and makeup perfect. She looked like every bride's dream, floating down the aisle toward her future. I'd waited until she was halfway down the aisle before I'd stood up. The movement had caught attention. People had turned. Jessica's eyes had found me in the crowd, and I'd seen the moment of recognition, the flash of confusion. Who was this stunning woman standing in the back? Why did she look familiar? And then I'd smiled, removed my sunglasses, let her see my eyes. I'd watched the color drain from her face, watched her footsteps falter, watched her mouth open in shock. "Adrian," she'd whispered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The murmur had spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Did she say Adrian? Is that... No, it can't be. Who is that woman?" I'd started walking toward her then, my heels clicking on the marble floor, every eye in the room turning to watch. I'd moved slowly, deliberately, letting everyone get a good look at me, letting them see the transformation, the wealth, the power. "Hello, Jessica," I'd said when I reached her. "Don't you look beautiful? Doesn't she look beautiful, everyone?" The crowd had murmured agreement, confused, uncertain. "Adrian?" she'd said again. "What are you doing here? How did you—" "I was invited," I'd said smoothly. "By your mother, actually. Though I think there was some confusion about who exactly was inviting whom." Patricia had been pushing through the crowd now, David behind her. "Ms. Reynolds, what's going on? Why are you—" She'd stopped, staring at me, really seeing me for the first time. "Adrian?" "Hello, Mother," I'd said. The word had hung in the air like a bomb. "It's been a while." The room had exploded into whispers. People pulling out phones, recording. David looking like he might faint. Tom frozen at the altar. Sarah crying openly in her bridesmaid's dress. "I wanted to thank you all," I'd said, raising my voice to address the room, "for teaching me such valuable lessons about family, about loyalty, about what really matters in life." "Adrian, you need to leave," Patricia had hissed. "This is Jessica's day. You're ruining—" "Ruining what? The perfect wedding I paid for?" I'd laughed. "Oh, didn't you tell them, Jessica? Didn't you mention that every single thing here, the venue, the dress, the flowers, the food, all of it was paid for by your dear sister? The one you've spent years tormenting and using?" Jessica had opened her mouth, but no sound had come out. "Let me tell everyone a story," I'd continued, "about a girl who was abused by her family, who gave everything she had to support a sister who hated her, a mother who resented her, a stepfather who ignored her, who had her fiancé stolen by that same sister, who was erased from her best friend's life, who was worked to the bone and given nothing in return." I'd turned in a slow circle, making sure everyone could hear me. That girl died, literally died, in a car crash that may or may not have been an accident. And do you know what happened next? Silence. Complete silence. "She came back," I'd said softly. "She came back with all her memories, all her pain, and all the knowledge of exactly how cruel her family could be. And she decided to give them a choice. She could have run, could have used her second chance to escape, but instead she let them think they'd won, let them repeat every betrayal, every cruelty. And then, when they were at their happiest, when they thought they had everything they wanted, I'd snapped my fingers. She revealed that the wealthy benefactor, the generous friend, the powerful CEO, was the sister they'd destroyed, was me." "You're lying," Patricia had said, but her voice had been weak. "You're not... You can't be... I'm Adrian Chen," I'd said clearly. "Legally, Adrian Reynolds, but born Adrian Chen. I'm the daughter you hid acceptance letters from, the sister whose fiancé you stole." I'd pointed at Jessica, "The best friend who you replaced as maid of honor." I'd found Sarah in the crowd. "And I'm the CEO who now owns every part of your future. I'd reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, handing it to David. Your consulting contract is terminated effective immediately. You'll be receiving a bill for the full amount paid as it was obtained under false pretenses. Another folder to Patricia. This is documentation of your daughter Jessica's charity fraud, the fake cancer scare, the thousands of dollars in donations that were never passed on to any legitimate organization. I've already forwarded this information to the California Attorney General's office. A third folder to Jessica. And this is the contract you signed with my foundation. The one that states all wedding content becomes foundation property and can be used for any purpose the foundation deems appropriate, including as evidence in fraud investigations. Jessica's hands were shaking as she took the folder. You can't. This isn't legal. It's completely legal. You should have read what you signed. I'd smiled at her. Oh, and Tom? I had your car inspected last week. Interesting thing about brake failures, sometimes they're accidental, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's evidence of tampering. Evidence that might suggest a certain mechanic with access to a certain car might have caused a certain crash. Tom had gone white as a sheet. I haven't gone to the police, I'd continued. Yet, consider this a wedding gift, my silence in exchange for yours. You never speak to Jessica again. You never contact my family again, and we all pretend this was just a runaway groom situation. You're insane, Patricia had spat. You've always been disturbed, jealous. I'm rich, I'd interrupted, richer than you could possibly imagine. I own the company where Sarah works. I own the building where you live. Yes, I bought it 3 months ago. I own the medical patents that are going to change the world, and I did it all while you thought I was nothing. While you used me and discarded me and never once considered that I might be capable of more. I'd looked around the room at the guests staring in shock, at my family falling apart in front of everyone. This was never about the money. It was about proving that your victim, your scapegoat, your failure, she was stronger, smarter, and more capable than all of you combined. You had every advantage. A loving mother, financial support, family connections, and you wasted it on cruelty and selfishness. I had none of that. I had abuse and neglect and betrayal. And I turned it into an empire. I'd turn to Jessica then for the final blow. You can still have your wedding. I've paid for it after all. But you'll do it knowing that everyone here knows the truth about you, that you're a fraud, a liar, and a thief, that you built your perfect life on the back of the sister you destroyed, and that she's the reason you have anything at all. I'd walked away then, my heels clicking on the marble, leaving them all standing there in shock and shame. Behind me, I'd heard Jessica's wail of anguish, the murmur of the guests, Patricia screaming at David, Sarah's quiet sobs. I hadn't looked back. The aftermath had been glorious. The wedding had continued, barely. Jessica had been too humiliated to go through with it, but Tom had been even more desperate to escape than before. They'd done a minimal ceremony with half the guests already gone, then disappeared. The marriage had lasted 3 months before he'd filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Really, it had been because she'd made his life a living hell, blaming him for my interference, for the ruined wedding, for everything. Patricia and David's marriage had fractured too. David had blamed Patricia for raising such a cruel daughter. Patricia had blamed David for not protecting them from me. They'd separated within 6 months, the legal bills and my claim for the return of the consulting money bankrupting them both. The charity fraud investigation had gone forward. Jessica had been charged with wire fraud and spent 2 years in minimum security prison. When she'd gotten out, she'd tried to rebuild her social media presence, but everyone had known who she was by then. The story had gone viral. Evil sister gets revenge at wedding had been a massive story online with everyone taking sides. Most had been on mine. Sarah had won the Nobel Prize in Medicine 4 years later for her revolutionary drug. In her acceptance speech, she'd thanked me by name, calling me the CEO who believed in me when no one else did. She'd never mentioned our history, never explained our connection, but I'd seen the sadness in her eyes when she'd looked at me in the audience, the weight of what she'd lost. She'd married eventually, had kids, built a good life, but we'd never been friends again. I'd made sure she succeeded, but I'd never forgiven her. I'm 34 now, in my second life. I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a billionaire, a philanthropist. I have everything I could ever want: power, wealth, respect, love. I married someone who'd never known the old Adrian, who fell in love with the woman I'd become. Sometimes I think about what I could have done differently. If I could have used my second chance to just escape, to build a new life without the revenge, without the pain. But then I remember standing in that ballroom, watching their faces as they realized what I'd become. I remember the sweet taste of justice, of vindication, of proving that I was more than they'd ever imagined. And I know I'd do it all again. Because some people deserve to be loved and supported, and some people deserve to learn that their victims can become their worst nightmares. My family learned that lesson well, and I'm at peace. There's a photo on my desk now. It was taken at a charity gala last year. I'm standing with a group of young women I mentor through my foundation. Real mentoring, not the fake kind I'd promised Jessica. These are women from abusive families, from neglectful homes, from situations where they've been told they're worthless. I tell them my story. Not all of it, the rebirth part stays secret, but enough. I tell them how I was destroyed by the people who should have loved me, how I built myself back up, how I won. And I tell them, you can too, because that's the real revenge. Not destroying my family, though that was satisfying. The real revenge is becoming someone who helps others escape the same fate, who takes the pain and turns it into power. My mother sent me a letter last year. She's sick, terminal cancer. She wants to reconcile before she dies. She wants forgiveness. I haven't responded. Some people earn forgiveness. She didn't. Jessica tried to friend me on social media last month. I blocked her. Sarah and I exchanged Christmas cards. Professional, polite, distant. It's more than she deserves. And me? I'm happy. Genuinely, completely happy. I have work I love, people I care about, a life of purpose and meaning. They tried to make me nothing. Instead, they made me unstoppable. That's my victory. That's my revenge. And it's better than I ever dreamed.